welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of several books, but who is here to discuss one in particular today that absolutely opened up my mind to an entirely new topic of collective food justice. It brings so many fascinating threads together: history, philosophy, cultural criticism, memoir, and it is just such a beautiful consideration of so many very large and important topics, and I am so excited for this chat. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be on here. My name is Husain, and I am a writer based in South London in the UK. As you mentioned, I've written a few books, and I would say that Tell Me How You Eat, the book that we're going to be talking about today, is kind of the culmination of sort of the thought process that runs through all of them. But also kind of just my life as, I suppose, I worked in publishing before I ever sort of became a writer. I worked particularly for most of those years in art publishing, so not the kinds of books that I write, but it gave me a kind of exposure to lots and lots of different visual art. I went on to do a PhD in art history, which is what I was doing when I wrote actually my last two books. And I got my start as a writer writing art and literary criticism, but not really straight up reviews, more kinds of essays that used art and literature and politics and life as a way into, my own life, the lives of people around me, as a way into thinking about big questions to do with the things that I perceive as making life worth living and the kind of ideological barriers to those things. So my first book was a short essay about fears and fantasies of being replaced, of human replacement. And yeah, that was a very short book, but it kind of like opened a lot of doors for me, gave me an opportunity to kind of like write at more length. And the next thing that I did was this, again, a book length essay, but this time visually illustrated, that I was asked to do literally just as an art historian for a photography publisher. And then it became this kind of big manifesto about meat and our relationship with meat and how it's mediated by visual culture. And the thoughts that I had while writing this book were really the germ of this book, which feels like, as I said, the culmination of so many things. And if I were to just sort of quickly introduce it in a sentence, or maybe that's impossible. I can't speak in I can't condense it all into one sentence. But it's a book. You mentioned food justice. It's a book about food justice, but it's also kind of a book about trying to imagine a whole new perspective on food and eating in general that is more socially and politically rooted than the very kind of individualistic and sometimes quite paralyzing and sort of depressing way that we have learned to think about food in terms of our diets, our health, our value as individuals.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the sort of line connecting all those works, because you do see an idea being worked out about food and sort of alienation and connection and a lot of really big things. For this book, usually when I interview authors, I ask them what the inception point is. Like when it's a novel, I ask about a character or a tone or what have you. But for something like this, and because you are a researcher, I am curious about the question that started this one. What was the question that you set out to answer?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. And actually, most people who have asked me about the book have asked me to introduce it in a kind of from a personal perspective, because the book does proceed from my own experience as an adult of really struggling to eat, like going through a period of finding something which, is obviously one of life's great pleasures, but also one of the fundamental things we have to do to stay alive. Finding it finding it really difficult. But that isn't the material of the book. The book is motivated by a question, and that question is, I suppose, what is it? What are the conditions that make eating sometimes feel joyful and wonderful and enabling? And what are the conditions that sometimes make it feel paralyzing, that sometimes make it feel oppressive, difficult, overloaded, with a significance that doesn't feel good? So that's kind of the fundamental question that the whole book is organized around. And it does that in many different ways. Like, it looks at the conditions in which people have starved, whether that's out of a sense of despair, or whether it's, for political reasons that are more hopeful and, trying to make something happen. It looks at ways that people have restricted their diets, and whether, looking at conditions in which restricted diets have been the symptom of a kind of repressive political culture, but equally contexts in which restrictive diets, there you go. I'm kind of like conditioning myself here. For example, veganism or vegetarianism have sort of enabled new things to happen, where they've been kind of like chosen as part of a way that enables people to eat and enables people to, do interesting political work. I look at the different ways that people have feasted, the different ways that people have fed one another. And, you think of feeding one another as a sort of uniformly benevolent thing, but actually I go into quite a lot of detail about how there are kind of, there are loving and caring ways to feed other people, but there are also coercive ways to feed other people. And then finally, I look at how the different ways in which food and eating and feeding can be used as a kind of focal point of political demands, but also a kind of tool of consciousness raising almost, whether that's through the pleasure in food, whether it's through the sharing of food, a way that people have been helped to imagine better worlds, or, fueled to do the work that it requires to create those worlds.
Mm. How do those questions then relate to the structure that you chose? I think it's really fascinating the way that you break it down into the chapters and how it's thematic, but it's also a little bit of a journey. And it brings together all of these different threads that we're talking about, the lived experience, the criticism, the history. Talk about what shaped those decisions, please.
Sure. So the structure for the book actually came to me kind of straight away as soon as I knew that I was going to write about this. And I didn't know I was going to write about this until I was feeling, much better from the kind of struggle that I described, at the beginning of this interview. I was feeling really, and this is not something that we should take for granted, because I think lots of people who struggle to eat, struggle throughout their lives to come through that experience. But fortunately, I found through a kind of unorthodox route that involved a lot of actually kind of like, I talk about, doing some psychedelic therapy and doing this soul searching, but also a sort of process of intellectual inquiry and a process of coming to be involved in food politics. I went through this process towards feeling quite inspired by this new way of eating that felt connected with like the wider world, rather than being so kind of like rather than eating feeling like something that was so personal, if you know what I mean. And so the structure for the book, as you say, it kind of traces that journey in a way. It goes from starving to asking questions about the restricted nature of my diet, to thinking about times where I had been, able to eat and what it was that enabled that, to being asked to cook for other people on a healing retreat and the questions that brought up, to finally getting involved in food politics. So the final chapter is about political demands. And when I was thinking back to all of those different, moments in the journey, I was really thinking very hard about what it was that might, on an unconscious level, have helped clear a path for me towards this more, joyful and empowered way of eating. And partly because of, the kind of person I am and the interest that I have, the kind of like the work that I've done in my life and the kind of education that I've had, a lot of those things were to do with cultural history, literary history, political history, stuff that I'd been interested in. So the book kind of like spotlights some of those things, but also goes much deeper into them through a research process. The book is, in a sense, like an artifact of research, maybe you might say. Um, and so while the book is structured in quite a neat way, it's neither historically chronological nor personally chronological. It kind of like free associates between all these different, some of them are political movements, some of them are creative movements. I'm just thinking like through the book, I talk about like suffragettes, ancient Romans, hippies in the 60s, Marxists, Black Panthers, sort of like farm workers in the 1960s, and like people involved in, food justice struggles today, and kind of relates them all to these broad themes, but also in a way that kind of like organically flowed from my personal experience, the things that were interesting to me during the period of like 2 or 3 years of, yeah, moving through this struggle with eating myself.
It's really lovely, and the way that you juxtapose all these ideas. Well, one thing, it's reflective of, I think, the way that people do research, like to boil it,
Mm.
to be very reductive, a lot of research is like putting two things next to each other and kind of seeing what happens, like what you get from
Yeah,
that
that's
comparison.
mhm.
And the other thing is, it's very interesting that I read this book right now because I very recently just read Michael Pollan's book
Mm.
about psychedelics. And I'm like, what is the universe telling me? But at the same time, you know, as you were speaking, I thought a lot about, psychedelics and activism and sort of like how those things might work together and how much both are really about like it breaking down hierarchies and like questioning categories and how you look at things. And, I feel like there's a really strong, I don't know, something in that journey makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think that's such a great way of describing research, by the way.
Hmm.
But also, yeah, with psychedelics, it's a really complex one, I think, because on the one hand, like you say, it is like collapsing hierarchies, opening people up to asking new questions. And I think that is exactly the kernel of the sort of psychedelic experience that I pull out in relation to the book. And that actually kind of probably helped the writing process in some ways. I talk in the book about basically going through the conventional treatment for eating disorders. In my case, it was anorexia, which, they do have some good results sometimes, but they're really, frighteningly ineffective on the whole, these conventional therapies. And, that can be for a number of different reasons. But in mine, I just felt like I was being sort of pushed towards normalizing my behavior without really asking any deep questions about why I might be struggling in the first place. So it felt like a very short-term solution in a way, like that, that it was just kind of like trying to get me to a point where I was alive, even if there was no interest in kind of like sustaining an outlook or a relationship to the world that might make it possible to, keep being well in the long term. And I ended up for various reasons, um, signing up kind of like partly out of like despair and frustration, but partly out of curiosity. Um, Signing up for this clinical trial involving that was sort of trying to work out the value of magic mushrooms or the active chemical in magic mushrooms for treating people with anorexia. And I can't really speak to the results of the study, partly because they haven't come out yet, and also partly because, the study is looking for the particular effects of these drugs on the brain and on neurobiology. It's not just looking at that, but that's one emphasis. But my interest was really in like, what that experience did for me in the longer term. And I would say that, while these are not necessarily very easy to pass or summarize the effects of. What I did experience was just this kind of new, even in just the way the study was designed, as opposed to the therapy that I've been through before. It was very respectful and curious towards me and what was going on with me. And that encouraged me to be respectful and curious about myself and to be open to imagining that this struggle might be to do with something other than, mere biology or, some of the other narratives around like feminine struggles with eating that have been kind of handed down over the decades. Um, and to be prepared to connect it with, who knows what. And, this is the very nature of the unconscious, is that it absorbs, you know, all kinds of untold things from the social world around us. Some might even say like the cosmos, but I mean, like, who knows? Um, and yeah, something about that like that love, that respect, that curiosity that went into the trial, I think really changed how I was operating as a thinker and a writer, and allowed me to approach this experience not just as something to be like ashamed of and to try and like move past and gloss over as quickly as possible, but as something to really, think about and ask questions about. And ultimately where I got to was, recognizing that during that period where I'd been really, not able to eat enough to, have a fully functioning body even, was that I was in a place of real despair, not personally, actually. My life was going quite well, but like politically, I'd
Mm.
experienced a lot of very formative political disappointments in kind of like, voluntary activist work that I was doing. I was very unsure about like how much scope there really is to do anything to change the world that we live in. And being able to kind of work through how that despair might get kind of crystallized into a relationship with food, which is obviously um, something that is very fraught with social meaning. Um, really, really helped me to work through it. It like gave me a framework, and a sort of non-judgmental and in a way kind of like intellectually exciting framework through which to think about, our relationship with food. So yeah, the book isn't really just about like healing our relationship with food. It's about like in a kind of like very dialogical, if that makes sense, way, thinking about how our relationship with food can affect our relationship with the world, and how our relationship with the world can in turn encourage us to have a more generative relationship with food.
Mm. That is, yeah, it's really fascinating to me. Um, because something that occurs to me in, the few experiences of nutritional or dietary medicine that I've encountered is
Mm.
that it has all sort of asked of me to ratchet up my awareness of what's going in my
Mm.
body on a very like
Mhm.
micro level. And for me, like more hypervigilance is never the answer for like greater peace or inner calm or or anything.
Yeah,
Really
yeah,
doesn't.
totally. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like kind of also one of, if there are takeaways, sounds very reductive, but like it is one of the key takeaways of the book, that like we can achieve so much more by thinking about like the way we eat as a society and what that kind of like helps us to imagine for the world, than what we're eating on, as you described it, like a micro level, and what that says about us. This is not to say that like, what we eat isn't important. I'm not like, trying to like deny that, for example, it really matters politically that like the food system as a whole, pushes quite malnourishing food, you might say, on people, and makes malnour sort of less than nourishing food the majority of what is available to most of us. And like, that's real, and that's a problem, and it has an effect on people's bodies, and it has a real effect in the world. But, we are then also, as part of the same political system, encouraged to take responsibility for that as individuals, and to, try and feel as and to feel as though we are able to fix the problem by fixating on the minutiae of our diets, which is also, that has come to pass for like ideological reasons. And there's partly a story there about the need to kind of hold bigger institutions to account, governments, corporations, like this kind of thing. But it can be very disempowering to say that to people, like, oh, it's not, these are problems that needed to be solved at a higher level, and in the meantime you just need to like suck it up and not have the diet that you would have in your ideal world. And so what I'm trying to do is address readers on an individual level, in a way that I hope will be like practically useful by encouraging a new sort of attitude to food, but one that kind of is connected with, firstly, like, inspiring ourselves to enjoy life and live, to take pleasure in food in a way that, instills an idea of what should be available to everybody, but then also to maybe like take that one step further and think about like what kinds of collective political actions it would take to create a world in which everybody was able to eat well easily. Um, and that has to do with time and money and resources and infrastructures and all of these kinds of things.
I am in love with the cover of this book. It features
Oh,
the artwork of one of my favorite pre-modern artists, and I'd love if you could talk about the choice and what it says about your book, or what you hope readers will connect with.
sure. You mean the apple?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because there's two different covers. The UK cover is different. It's like a detail from a painting by Hieronymus Bosch,
Oh,
but
that
the
is the one I'm
US
talking
cover.
about. I'm talking about the
Oh, I
Hieronymus
see.
Bosch. I'm sorry.
Not no no no. That's fine. I was going to say because the US cover is a painting by Magritte.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
Yes, which is this like giant apple filling a whole room. And that's also really
Yeah.
relevant to the book because it's, Magritte, his work is very much about kind of trying to disrupt people's expectations in what they see. So you see an apple and you expect to see something, and then but there's something jarring and weird about the picture, which felt really cool to me because it was like, it felt like it was mirroring this method that I tend to use as a writer of trying to like estrange people from received orthodoxies and look at things differently and ask new questions um, about food. But the Bosch cover I also love. Um, and yeah, it's like an image of a strawberry with all these men, naked people like huddled around it. Um, and the way that I talk about Bosch in the book is actually to do with a different uh, detail to do with the punishment of gluttons in the afterlife, which is like much more gruesome. But the strawberry image is also very haunting. And I think, to me, it says something about the kind of like the sort of the like eternal attachment in a kind of like desperate way that we have towards food. And how it kind of like, food doesn't always bring us together. It can sometimes be used as a weapon of war, but the way that it like attracts all these people in a kind of relation to each other around it in a way that is both full of like desire and longing, but it can also feel very sinister and strange. I
Mm.
mean, I don't know. That's what it says. What does it say to
Yeah.
you? I'm so curious.
I love that. So I confession, I was a medieval historian before I fell into
Oh, no
libraries.
way.
And yeah, for me the cover says, because the figures are also very lean, naked.
Mhm.
And to me it connected to something that, it might have been in the book and it might have been in an essay that I read of yours, and now I can't remember. I apologize. But something about how like during deprivation or starvation, all you can think about is food. So I thought
Yeah,
about it
yeah.
being like sort of,
Hmm.
this is how food will occupy your mental landscape during deprivation or
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, a medieval historian told me the other day that apparently lots of people refer, I mean, that's obviously Earthly Delights is like a huge painting with loads of things going on in it, but apparently historians often refer to it as the strawberry painting.
yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I feel privileged that the strawberry gets to be on the cover of the book.
Oh, it's so lovely. I would love to, even though it is haunting, like I would just love to encounter a strawberry that big in relation to me. I still think that would
Oh
be,
yeah,
yeah.
it'll be awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and our listeners. What is next for you? I know that, finishing a book like this is probably exhausting and you're, still promoting this one, but are you writing towards a future project right now or?
I am, and I am actually at the moment trying to do something completely different. I think like it's been really fun to write this book. I think that, it felt really important to me to write it to communicate the things that are in it. But it's a very difficult genre to write in, like essays, essentially. I think it is essentially essays where you're trying to communicate lots of complex ideas, but you're also trying to do it in a narrative way to like let the ideas kind of like perform for the audience. And I found that actually that was one of the greatest rewards of working on the book was trying to find, ways of telling a story. So I'm interested in kind of leaning in more to um, writing more narrative, maybe fiction. I haven't quite worked out what my new project is going to be, but it is going to be something different.
Ooh, that's very exciting. Well, I wish you luck on that, and thank you again for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
You're welcome. Listeners, please check out Tell Me How You Eat: Food, Power, and the Will to Live. It's out right now as we speak, and it will be out as you hear this. So please head to your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for your books. All right. Thank you, everyone. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.